My name is William Maroney, and this is my podcast report for the second Radiolab podcast, the Stochasticity one. And jump right into question one. I think that the podcast was trying to convey the point that randomness is actually a lot more convoluted than most people tend to think it is. And truly random data is honestly, in my opinion, more dictated by the way in which it's collected than, the results of the data itself, which is, I think, why the podcast mentions that a lot of time when you see an example of real random data, it doesn't feel like intuitively random enough to you. And I think a good example of this is the coin flip experiment they did with the professor from UCal Berkeley. And they basically just flipped the coin like 100 times. One group flipped an actual coin, the other group made up answers, and the professor was able to identify the group that had actually flipped the coin instantly because there was more patterns in there basically. And intuitively, when we think of something being random, you tend to think of a lack of patterns, so it made it very easily visually identifiable which group was making them up in their head to be random and which group was actually collecting real data. And another example of a common misconception about this is the lottery ticket example they use. And they discuss how this one lady won the lottery 2 years in a row. And on paper, when you think about that, like the odds have to be astronomically low. And it's true that the odds of, one individual person winning the lottery 2 years in a row are about, according to the podcast, roughly like 1 in 17 trillion. But if you start to kind of increase your sample size and look at the bigger picture, the odds of anybody anywhere who's playing the lottery winning it 2 years consecutively in a row are much more likely than the odds of, one particular person. So that's a great example of something that seems almost impossible, but in reality, when you kind of look at the whole sample size and put it all into perspective, it's much more likely than you think. Um, and going into the second question for my outside example, I wanted to talk about the movie Moneyball. I'm personally just a big Brad Pitt fan. I thought it was a great movie, but basically in the movie, Brad Pitt's working as a manager of a baseball team, and he's kind of underfunded and having to compete in a league where, a lot of these other managers have a lot more capital to work with than he does. So the strategy he kind of employs to get around that is that instead of going for like your like Babe Ruth kind of 5-star recruit kind of, baseball player, he targets players that might have worse scouting reports. And if you think about it, like he's going for players that have a lower probability of performing, like a game-winning play compared to a higher ranked player. But he's actually able to leverage this to his benefit because these players are being, they're not being looked at by the big teams, and he's putting a lot less capital into recruiting these players who still, even if they have, a 1 in 10 chance of hitting a home run compared to a 5 in 10 chance, that's still a chance that it happens, and he's able to leverage that fact and spend a lot less capital and end up with a team that still has the potential to, win games and still performs well. And I think that's a great example of how sometimes just intuitively thinking about probability and random chance in general, we can make inefficient decisions because our understanding of those probabilities or the random chance at hand might not really, be looking at the whole perspective, kind of like I mentioned with the lottery ticket example. And I think that this movie is a great example because it makes sense. Like intuitively, if I asked you, would you rather have the guy on your team who has a higher probability of hitting a home run every time he's at bat, or who has a lower probability of hitting a home run? Of course, you're going to say the guy with the higher probability. But in reality, with the finances and just the actual application of those probabilities in a game scenario, Brad Pitt's team still competes pretty well, even though, these guys don't have the highest chances of hitting home runs or, making game winning catches, stuff like that. So I thought that was a great example. And for the third question, I thought that in listening to the podcast, I was honestly most surprised kind of about like the application of probability and randomness to real life events. And I thought the basketball example they used was really good. It's basically just discussing how intuitively you would think that when a player gets hot or something on the court, you would have an increased probability of making a shot. So, if you just took 3 shots from the corner and you made all 3 of them, you would think that 4th shot is probably going to go in. Like, the last 3 instances have shown that it will probably go in. But in reality, that concept of being hot is not true. And statistics show that oftentimes it's actually the opposite, that if they've just made 3 shots in a row, their chance of making that 4th one actually drops comparatively to the previous shots. And for that example, they were using I think the 83 Phillies or something, or 76ers, sorry. But I just thought that was interesting because it's another example of something that intuitively, just off the top of your head, it makes sense that you would think there's a greater probability or greater random chance. But in reality, and the big picture kind of zoomed out, that's just not true. And I think that overall this podcast did a really good job of, getting me to question and analyze my understanding of probability and randomness as a whole. And it definitely challenged what I kind of would think intuitively about a lot of scenarios with random chance involved, and just kind of what that looks like in real life scenarios compared to, just the on paper version of it. And I think that these examples in the podcast are stuff that people like me can, like general audience, can grasp and understand and apply to your life using, past experiences pretty well. So I really enjoyed the podcast, and it definitely changed the way I kind of think about and approach probability in real life scenarios.